Hey, everybody. Welcome to DCARI's fourth virtual training session. Tonight we have Trevor Maynard. He is a fire protection engineer, mechanical engineer with the ATF's Fire Research Laboratory based in Annandale, Maryland. Trevor has a background with the Department of Forestry, U.S. Department of Forestry, and he's also a PhD in mechanical engineering. Tonight he's going to talk us through timelines and how to normalize times as you conduct fire investigations, or specifically really any investigations. So without any further ado, Trevor, go ahead and take it over, bud.
All right, thank you, Bill. Yeah, this is the first time I've ever done an online class like this. It's pretty cool. We got a lot of attendees, and I see a lot of names I recognize out there. So yeah, thank you all for showing up. I'm going to go ahead and show the PowerPoint. So hopefully that's up there now.
Looks good.
Assuming I can still hear you when it's up. Okay, good. All right. Well, again, thank you. So we'll start the presentation. This is a topic that was something. So my personal background is in fire science, fire dynamics. That's how I got involved in first in wildland fire in the Forest Service, and then came to ATF about 5 years ago. And you know, this topic of timeline analysis is something that was completely different for me. It was never something that I had considered doing. I didn't really know it existed. This is something I think, like for all of us, this is something that comes as part of the job, and it's sort of something required for us to figure out how to do. And now with the proliferation of electronic data and devices that are out there, it's becoming more and more important to actually get these timelines synchronized, normalized, because we're starting to get so much data that we've got all these closely spaced events. We need to make sure that we're actually understanding the sequence of events. So that's really what this presentation is about. You know, realistically, this could be a week-long class on all the different types of data sources and how to find the times and how to make sure they're correct. Really, in an hour, all we can do is scratch the surface. So what we're going to do is kind of go through the basics of timeline normalization. We're going to look at some of the sources that are out there that you probably are all very familiar with. And then towards the back half of the presentation, we'll go through that spreadsheet that Bill talked about. And that's a tool that some of us in ATF have used for taking information from all these different sources and normalizing them and being able to get a master timeline out of it. So again, purpose of this presentation is really just to help, you know, it's a discussion on what are the types of sources of information that are out there now. And again, every day there's more and more, especially with home automation system, things like Amazon Echo, Nest devices, Ring doorbell cameras, that sort of thing. So we're gonna look at how can we take all those different sources, normalize the clocks, make sure all the clocks are synchronized, and actually compare those events to each other. I will share some of the things that we have learned on the ATF side. I know Adam and Cameron and a few others are out there that I've worked with a lot, and so I'll share some of the issues that we've seen investigations in the past, and then again we'll go through that Excel timeline tool. Just a disclaimer: so with the stuff that we talk about here, particularly with the spreadsheet, you know, that spreadsheet's been around for a few years. You know, several hundred people have used it at this point, but at the end of the day, there's always a potential for error. So when you are transcribing things like CAD sheets or witness statements or events from a camera onto a spreadsheet, there's certainly issues that you could have with transcription errors. And of course, there's always a potential for computer errors. So, you know, if you use this spreadsheet and you put all the information in there, you really want to go back and check and just do a reality check and say, does this actually make sense with what I know from the raw data that I have? A second disclaimer, again, so we can't, you know, unfortunately, this is not a digital forensics class, so we're not going to be able to get into the specifics of all the different devices, you know, how to actually access the data, how to decode the data. A lot of these things now, especially with, you know, even alarm systems, but more things like Ring doorbell cameras, home automation systems, some of those things you really need to get with the subject matter expert to make sure that you're interpreting that data correctly. And at the end, I'll mention some resources that might be available to you guys through ATF that might be helpful. I'm going to start with a brief case study. And this was actually a case, I wasn't involved in this fire investigation. Actually, Adam, who I see on the line, he was actually the fire protection engineer here. But I'm going to share this because I think that Adam and I think Cameron and a few others, and Bill actually was involved in this. This scene actually really came down to a few critical pieces of timeline data. So this was back in February 2017. This was a golf course clubhouse in St. Charles County, Missouri. As you can see, building was completely destroyed. Here's an aerial view here. There's a link to a YouTube drone video of this fire if you're interested. Big fire, right? Pretty much destroyed the entire building. And ATF's national response team came out to assist the state and local investigators with the investigation. And we're only going to talk about a brief snippet of some of the data here. So obviously this was a much bigger investigation, but we're going to look at some of the specifics of the timeline. So the very first indication of the fire was a 911 caller. He was traveling from south to northeast on the road, and you see the red circle in the building. That's actually where he saw indication of. Hey, Bill, I'm getting a bunch of feedback. Is that?
Yeah, I just muted it. I think you're good now. Go ahead.
Okay. So he was traveling northeast on this road going past the fire building. He calls 911. This is about I think about 10 to maybe 10 to midnight. And he sees a bunch of fire at the southwest corner of this building. And here's a street view picture pre-fire. There's his photo there on the lower left. So you can kind of see the roof pitch there of the little turret shaped part of the building. So he sees a bunch of fire blowing out of the back of that building. So fire investigator, right, job is to figure out where did the fire start and how it start. And some of the basic questions are, well, it's a multi-story building, so what floor did it start on? Okay, we get the floor, what room did it start on? Room did it start near? And then was it inside or outside? So this clubhouse had been in use the day of the fire. There's a dining room, there's a bar lounge area, and then there's an outdoor patio kind of overlooking the greens. And I think the building had been open the day of the fire, so there were people in and out of there all day. Again, this is several hours after it closed. But when Bill and Adam and Cameron started pulling the data together from this fire, there were three sources of timeline information that ended up being really important. You had the 911 caller information from his phone. You had the 911 dispatch center, and then you had the fire alarm system. It was really more of a combined fire security alarm system. But what the investigators did here was look at from these three sources of information, combine these three sources together and try to get a more complete picture of how this event actually unfolded. So here's a plan view of the building. First indication of fire again was about 10 to midnight. He sees fire at the back of the building, and you can see where it says open deck there on the plan view. That's that little turret where he saw fire. From the alarm data, at 11:50 and 48 seconds, they had a smoke detector activation in the bar and lounge. 3 seconds later, there was a detector activation in a lobby hallway towards the other side of the building. And 11:52 is when he actually took that photo. So he called 911, spoke to the dispatcher, and then took that photo. And 11:55 is when the first engine company arrives on scene. So we've got some pretty important events here. The problem is they're from three different sources. So in looking at this, where the timeline normalization has been done, it's already been checked, all the times are good. This gives us a really good picture of where this fire started. So to answer the questions, what floor? Another piece of information is the first floor smoke detectors didn't activate until a long time after the fire department got there. So they're very confident that this was a second floor origin. The bar lounge area smoke detectors activated first, but an important point there is that 911 caller saw fire clearly out of the back of the building. He mentioned he saw fire blowing out of the back about a minute before those smoke detectors activated. So as a fire investigator, that kind of gives you a hint that if we're talking about an interior-exterior fire, we had fire present outside of the building prior to the smoke detectors inside activating. So this ultimately ended up being and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this was ultimately determined that it was an outdoor fire on this outdoor patio that was started by discarding smoky materials that had smoldered for some time into the evening.
Correct, and a planter, I believe.
In a planter, and so that went and then eventually migrated into the structure. So the question is, what if we didn't know the sequence of this data? So we have these great data points, but the only reason we can make sense of it is because we have the sequence timeline. So even if you just take away one of those time data points, so we take away the smoke detectors, that was a huge data point for us. If we no longer know where those fall into the timeline, that completely blows up our ability to use this information for the origin. Certainly we can still use it, but it's not going to give us that complete picture that it did when we had the normalization done. So what if it wasn't properly normalized? So in the first case here, what I'm showing you is a table of times, and this is with the correct normalization. So this is what we already saw. First event was a 911 call. He sees fire blowing out of the back of the building. After that, you get the interior smoke alarms. Then he takes his picture, and then the first engine arrives. Now let's talk about a hypothetical scenario where that alarm data was off by about 2 minutes. And let's say that the investigators didn't account for that. So, they got the data from the alarm company. They assumed the clock was right. It was 2 minutes slow. How would that change our picture? So let's look there. So if we didn't go through that normalization process and that fire alarm data was 2 minutes slow, that would actually shift those smoke alarm events prior to the first 911 call. And in this specific scenario, that can make a huge difference because you go from your normalized correct scenario where that was really only consistent with an exterior fire breaching into the building. If you no longer have the correct normalized times here, and you've got these 2 minutes slower time for the smoke alarms, that could definitely indicate an interior fire breaking out. So just by having those normalization for those three sources, that was incredibly important to be able to figure this fire out. That could have made a huge difference in terms of where they had to dig, where they had to process the scene, and ultimately to the origin and cause determination. So that's a relatively simple case. It's only three sources of data, but I think that's a powerful illustration of if we don't get it right, it can definitely lead us down the wrong path. So timelines, I know there are a lot of investigators on the line here, and certainly that obviously doesn't just apply to fire, but to investigations in general, whether it's criminal investigations, accidents, incidents, what have you. Timelines are always a critical piece of that. Certainly for the origin, it can limit where we have to dig in the scene. Obviously for cause, you can come up with lots of reasons why timeline data is important for cause. But an important thing to remember is, and like we saw in the last example, is just one piece of timeline data can really change the entire course of investigation. So the more and more data that we get, it's great that we're getting all of this data now, but there can also be pitfalls with that because if we're not interpreting it properly, that can definitely lead us down an incorrect path. So scientific method, that's really what is kind of our guiding principle for fire investigations. When we're talking timelines, really that falls into the collection and analysis of data portion. So with timeline data, what we are doing is taking raw data, we're analyzing it and using that to help develop our hypothesis. This normalization that we're going to talk about is a critical part of that analysis. And if you don't do it, it really makes a lot of your timeline data invalid. So the process of normalization, I think probably all of us have done this in one form or another. Normalizing just means that if I have different sources that all have their own individual clocks, I've got to make sure that all of those sources can reference a master clock. So I want to have one master clock that I can compare all of these sources to and figure out how far they all are off from that master clock and know what those offsets are to be able to correct those times. That's what's called normalization. We'll use the terms exact or approximate or hard versus soft times. Hard times or exact times are anything that has a timestamp that can actually be normalized back to a master clock. And we'll go through some examples of how to do that. If you can't normalize it back to a master clock, it's an approximate time. The most common approximate times that we deal with are witness statements. So somebody says, yeah, it was around 5:30 when I got home from work, and then I smelled smoke 15 minutes later. That's an approximate time. Things like security logs where people sign in sheets, where people have manually signed in, those are estimated times. It doesn't mean that they're worthless. They're absolutely valuable. And a lot of times that might be the only data you have. But you need to consider the limitations of those just being approximate times. They can't be normalized to an official clock. So some of the sources, I'm gonna go through some examples. I can't see the chat window right now because I've got this window open, but as I go through this, we'll go through some sources. If you want to just type in the chat window some of the sources that maybe you found in your investigations, maybe some things that we don't talk about or don't think of. There's so much out there now that has good hard timestamp data. It'd be good to share what's out there that we don't cover. The first one is obviously video. The first thing pretty much I think every fire investigator does is canvass the area for video. We try to get video from witnesses. I think we've all seen that, you know, one video can completely change the nature of an investigation. You can go from, you know, spending 3 weeks in a scene with 20 people digging to, you know, being done in a day or two just based on video. You know, unfortunately, it never seems like we get the video that we want. You know, here the example of the video you want. There's a guy throwing a Molotov cocktail. You've got this great timestamp camera here. You can see the guy's face. If you're a criminal investigator and you're investigating a Molotov cocktail, that's a great video. What we usually get is something like at the bottom where, you know, it's really grainy video, the timestamp is wrong, there's an error with the camera, or you get social media posts that people bring you and, you know, people just want to help and they say, hey, I've got this great video of this fire. You know, but realistically, usually the fire department's already there, it's blurry, it's really of no help. So all you can do is kind of say thanks and file it with the rest of your data. I think we all know the value of video. And we'll go through some specific examples with actually getting data, time data from videos. Phones are another big one, not only from phone and text records, but also from photos that people take on their phone. So a lot of, you know, people come and bring you photos of a fire that they took. So being able to figure out, you know, there's a timestamp on that photo, being able to figure out whether the timestamp is accurate or not is very important. We kind of always assume, and maybe it's not safe to assume, but it's, you know, the first assumption is that the timestamp on the phone is correct. And the reason for that is your cell phone is synchronized to the network. So great example of that is when you put your phone in airplane mode and fly to a different time zone or a different country, as soon as you land, you turn your phone back on, the time zone automatically adjusts, you know, within seconds. That's because that phone is syncing to the network. So generally, timestamps on phones are accurate. The exception is pretty much every phone that I've seen, you can actually manually set the clock. So this screenshot here in this example, I was sending texts actually just back and forth to myself. But you can see that I sent these texts at 2:55. After 2:55, I went and actually manually changed the clock to 1 p.m. And now every message after that is stamped as 1 p.m. So if you're the investigator and you're just looking through this phone, you might be a little confused because you sort of went backwards in time. And so you might think it maybe was the next day or this was the prior day. It's important to just check the clock on the phone. And we'll talk about how to do that. You just want to check the clock on the phone and make sure that it matches up with the current time. Alarm data is a big one. That case study I showed certainly really hinged on alarm data. Both from, you know, fire alarms, security alarms, and then combination systems. The two general sources that we get, the first one is from the central station. So when you get data from the alarm company, that's one of the first things I think we kind of all ask for. That's coming from what's called the central station. So they're actually recording the events, and that's the alarm company working between the alarm and the dispatch. So central station logs are usually pretty good, especially for commercial fire alarm systems. They'll contain almost all of the trouble and supervisory warnings. Certainly all the alarms will show up. You'll see the daily communication tests. So the central station log is great. It doesn't always contain everything. So there could be data local to the alarm or security panel that you may not get from the central station. Examples are things like on a security alarm, the door delay. So if you have a 60-second door delay, you have that. So I can open the door and enter the code into the keypad without the alarm going off. That's probably never going to be transmitted to the alarm company, but that may still be useful data. So central station log is a great place to start. The alarm panel is certainly another potential really good source of data if it's not damaged or destroyed, which oftentimes it is. And we'll go through some examples with alarm panels. CAD data, I think we're all pretty familiar with dispatch data. Again, that's one of the first things that the first fire investigator that's there is going to ask for. CAD data is hugely useful because you've got time of first notification from 911. You do have transcribed witness statements. Certainly, you've got all the responding resources and their arrival times. You also have the dispatcher's interaction with the alarm company. And all of that data is very nicely time-stamped. The one thing to think about with CAD data is that it's not always perfect, right? So you've got a dispatcher, and that dispatcher is dealing with all kinds of calls. So they're receiving calls, they're trying to dispatch out maybe to other dispatch centers, they're trying to talk to responding units. So they've got a lot going on. There's some delayed input information. There's also the potential for transcription errors. And there's also the potential for some, maybe some interpretation of what somebody said, or maybe some shorthand. So even though you've got a nice exact timestamp of when the information was entered, you still need to look at that in context and make sure that it's accurate. The last thing, one of the last sources that we've really started dealing with lately is building network data. So nearly every building now, whether it's a residence or a commercial building, has some sort of internet connected device inside. There are very few, certainly commercial buildings now, that don't have a connection to the outside world. So some of the things that we've had success with, we're getting timestamp data off of network switches, wireless routers, some of the home automation systems and vending machines. And when I say we've had success, the kind of information that we were getting was, when did this piece of equipment go offline? So when did it stop communicating with the server? Does that 100% mean that the fire impacted it at that minute and that's why it went off? No, but as you collect more and more of that data, it does help you create a better picture of what happened, and potentially you can figure out sort of these cascading failures of these devices, kind of like you would with arc mapping. So how do you get that data? Again, this is not a digital forensics presentation. We've had the most success dealing with, for commercial buildings, is just talking to the IT manager. So whoever actually services the IT equipment for that building, they can generally go on to like the Cisco server or whoever their network server is, and look at the times where things actually started to drop. So that's a great first source of information. You can also go to the internet service provider. You can go to the companies like Google, Nest. The issue there, I think, is, and those of you that are investigators probably have more knowledge than I do, a lot of them now are requiring subpoenas, which certainly bogs down the time frame for getting that information. And again, hardware, just like alarm panels, some hardware does store data, but generally it's encrypted and encoded, and you really need a subject matter expert with that hardware to help you really understand it. Kind of last thing on devices, again, with the proliferation of internet connected devices, there's a huge number of things that are out there that potentially have valuable information. Unfortunately, there's no magic key for getting into all these and getting the data. Again, you really need a subject matter expert. Those of you that have access to digital forensic investigators, they're a great resource. On the ATF side, we have digital forensics investigators, as well as we have electrical and electronics engineers that can help. But generally, what we found is the manufacturer and the technicians are going to be the best first resources for you. And it's just really important, you don't want to get this wrong. So the worst, it's great to have the data, but if you misinterpret it, that's just going to cause you a lot more problems than if you never had the data at all. So the fun part with the math, how do we normalize times? So I mentioned we have to have an official or a standard clock. What we have used, and I think probably what a lot of you have used, is the official US time, which you go to time.gov. That's the website hosted by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. That is the official US time, and it's based on an extremely precise atomic clock in Colorado. So there's a picture of it. So this is our standard time that we use for referencing all of our sources back to you. So what's great if you have a smartphone, they recently updated it. So this is in the last couple of months. So it's much more user-friendly now for a mobile device. So when you go to time.gov, whether you go on a desktop or you go on your iPad or a smartphone, you will see this map of the United States. You see the time zones. You'll see some of the other time zones in the territories in Alaska. That's going to show you the actual official US time to the second in each time zone. So this will be a running clock that's just counting up. So if you have a smartphone and you're connected to the internet, you always have access to the official time. Another thing now that they've added, which they didn't used to have, which is in the lower right, you can kind of see that analog clock. This is really neat. It tells you how far your own device's clock is off from the official US time. So how do we normalize times? It's relatively simple in concept. What gets irritating and where you can make a lot of mistakes is the arithmetic, which is why we're going to go through that Excel tool. What you want to do, so whatever your source of information is, you want to have a live view of that source's clock. So here an example is, this is a DVR from a fire scene. You can actually see a smoke plume back there. I believe this was actually a dash cam police car. So we're looking at, you're going to try to get a live view of the running clock and compare that to time.gov. And what you want to find is what is the difference. So I'll show you guys kind of a live example of that. I'm going to stop sharing this and I'll share my web browser. Actually, I'm going to share my entire screen here. Bill, are you able to see the other windows that I'm opening up?
I can.
Okay, good. Do you see the camera here?
Yeah, see. Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is just a webcam I found online. This is a live view of Las Vegas. So somebody online is controlling the camera, but you can see the clock up there. So this is just like if you were looking at a DVR, you know, in a security office or wherever. So you're looking at a live feed of that DVR. And what we're going to do is take our time.gov window and we're going to compare the two. So Bill, can you see both of the windows I have open?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. So Las Vegas is in the Pacific time zone. You can see right now, this is 4:32:35 on the camera clock. It looks like it's off by close to about 30 seconds from time.gov. The question is that a significant time difference or not? Most times, maybe not. But again, if you're dealing with things like alarm events or cascading failures of network equipment, 30 seconds can be a very long time, can be very important in your overall timeline. You saw with that country club fire how big of a difference that 2 minutes made. So again, whether you have it in a web browser, you have a smartphone, again, this is just kind of an illustration of how you want to go and do that. So if you're just trying to find the clock on someone else's cell phone, take their phone, put it side by side with yours. Usually what we'll do is actually take a picture of the two devices together with a separate camera or phone, and that way we kind of memorialize that time difference so that we have it. So here's kind of an illustration. I won't go through the math, but really, again, it's just adding and subtracting. You got to figure out what is the time offset for each of those sources. If the source is slower than the master clock, you've got to add that time difference to all the events. If it's faster than the source clock, you've got to subtract all the events. And this is where you can really run into trouble if you're doing this by hand. You know, I'm an engineer. I love math. It's you know, math is like kind of my second language, but I cannot do manual arithmetic of time differences like 60 seconds, you know, 60 minutes per hour. It's just very easy to just screw it up. And I will invariably make mistakes. And that's kind of what led us to putting together a spreadsheet tool to do it so that we don't have to worry about, you know, counting on our fingers and getting that right. So the next question is, you know, we had that nice live view of the clock. What happens if we don't have that? One example of that, so you generally don't have access to the 911 dispatch center clock unless you are there at the dispatch center. But you can always call them and ask. Same thing if you don't have access to a DVR, but you know somebody else still has it and is able to look at it. You can call them and ask. Even with dispatch centers, it's kind of a weird request. Most times when I call them, they're like, they don't really understand what I'm asking. So you kind of just have to explain, look, I'm trying to compare your clock to a different clock. I usually just give them a 3, 2, 1 countdown, have them read the time. Simultaneously, I'll be looking at time.gov on my phone, and we'll record the difference. And again, really important thing to ask before you hang up is just ask them if there's any reason why their clock might have changed. And again, it could have changed and they're not aware of it. That's a risk that you run, but you really just want to ask them and be as sure as you can that that clock is accurate and it's the same time that it was on the at the time of the incident. Like cell phones, CAD clocks are not always accurate. And what I mean by that is they're not always synchronized with the official US time. A CAD system for, a county or major metro area, really what they're doing is logging times of when calls came in, when units got dispatched, when they arrived. Their first concern is not necessarily whether that's accurate to the official time. They just want relative times between events. So we've seen CAD systems be off by several minutes, especially where we've noticed that is when they're bouncing dispatches between dispatch centers. You can see some compounding of time differences. So, and with central stations that serve multiple time zones, we've seen that as well. So again, just always verify. It's worth that 2-minute phone call to call them and ask. It's definitely worth your time. And again, I mentioned cell phones earlier. So this is a screen capture from time.gov from my personal phone. And I was actually really surprised to see. So my personal phone, the clock is synced to the network, but it's about 3.2 seconds off when I saw this. When I restarted my phone, it was still about a half second off. And I think if you saw my computer time is somewhere a couple of seconds off. So it's just good to know whatever device you're using, even when you think it's right on, it may be off by several seconds. And that could be important. So while I'm talking, just kind of an experiment for you guys to do and type into the chat. Whether you have an iPad or a phone or a computer, just go to time.gov. And once it loads, look for that analog clock in the lower right-hand corner. And just type in what kind of device you have and how much it's off by. This is when we do timeline class in person, we have everyone look at their phone. But this is kind of cool because we can actually record and see how far people's are off. I was actually surprised. I always thought they were synced much closer than this, but 3 seconds is a pretty big difference. Some of the pitfalls that we've come across, if you have multiple investigators with different phones, different computers, syncing times, it just becomes a mess of a bunch of different people doing time sync. We tried to help mitigate that with the spreadsheet tool a little bit, which I'll show you when we go through that. Forgetting to synchronize one or more sources, it's kind of funny, but that has happened to us. So 9 out of 10 sources were perfectly synced and normalized, but that 10th source wasn't, and that completely threw the entire investigation off. So if you do it for one, you've got to do it for all of them. And something that I'm sure a lot of investigators have encountered, if you're looking at surveillance camera video with an embedded player on your PC, I've noticed a lot of times the timestamp on that will actually adjust to the time zone of your computer. I know ATF, we've come across that a bunch of times, and a couple times we got really confused until we figured out what was happening. So that's not necessarily a normalization thing. That's just more of a, hey, I'm trying to see what time did this event occur. Just make sure that your computer is not somehow resyncing that clock on the embedded video player. Another thing, Cameron and I worked a fire a few months ago where there's potentially some really good data from vending machines, or so we thought. Vending machines now most of them have credit card readers as well as internet connected inventory monitoring devices that ping back and forth to the vending machine company. What we found in that specific instance was it really only reported once every 24 hours. So the day of the fire reported, the fire happened at night, and then the next day it just didn't report because the building had already burned down, power's off, network was down. So that information really wasn't useful, but it could be. So it's just important though to remember that not everything is communicating multiple times per second like a cell phone or a wireless router is. Last thing, which is not really related to normalization, but just another thing we've come across. If you're getting videos and photos from witnesses, you don't want to get those as text messages. The process of converting those to an SMS message, it actually compresses them and strips away some of the metadata. So the best way is to get it as a direct transfer off of the device, like off of an SD card, or if you can't, email them is still a better alternative, but getting it directly from the device is the best option. So we're going to talk about the Excel tool, which Bill posted for download. And I have an interactive demo here. It's about 20 minutes long, so we're right about on time. I'm going to actually just show a video of me going through it. Kind of wasn't sure how the interactive demo was going to go here. So I'm going to play the video of me going through a demo with it. So I'll just be sitting here and I'll play it. And then if questions come up, like Bill said, throw them in the chat and we'll go through and answer those. Again, this is just a tool that we use. It's helped us a lot in some of these, especially some of these bigger investigations. So maybe it'll help you guys. So I'm going to switch to.
And Trevor, if everybody could just drop your volume down when we did the test for this, it was pretty loud. So he'll hit play, but turn your volume down and then just bring your volume back up, especially if you have any earbuds in.
Okay, Bill, are you able to see the video now with the white screen?
I got it.
Okay, I'm gonna play. If something's up with the sound, just start yelling and I'll fix it.
Okay.
Okay, we are going to go through the process of setting up one of these timeline sheets and kind of just taking a look at how it works. Very first thing, so I'm going to go download it from my email. The reason I'm showing you that is most computers, most Windows computers, if you download this attachment, if you open it up straight from your email, Windows will probably block the macros. And what a macro is, it's a little piece of code inside of an Excel spreadsheet that actually allows it to do the functions that we want it to do. Some people in the past have used those as carriers for computer viruses, so that's why Windows will kind of by default try to block those. The first way around that is to actually just save a copy of it to your desktop. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do save as to my desktop. I'll save a copy there, and I will open it from there. So don't open it from your email. Save it somewhere on your computer and open it there. So I will open that. It's going to take a second, and we'll see if I get any warnings. I shouldn't get any warning banners because I've already enabled all of the macro security on or disabled the macro security on my computer. If you open this Excel sheet and you get something that looks like what we saw in the presentation, you may get one of the two of these banners, or you might get both. Go ahead and click Enable Content, Enable Editing. If you still cannot use it, you can send me an email and I can try to see what the issue is. It may just be your actual macro security settings. Some of you, especially with agency computers, they may not allow you to use macro-enabled things at all. So you may have to contact your IT person and see if they can help you out with.
I'm pausing the video real quick. You'll notice there's two slides I didn't show. Those are the last two. Sorry about that. That's where that banner comes up. The other thing that Bill and I learned 2 days ago is that the Apple iOS does not allow these Visual Basic macros to run. So for now, if you're trying to run it on an Apple computer, it's not going to work. It's got to be on Windows, unfortunately. That might change. I saw some comments that maybe they're going to incorporate that, but for now, it is Windows only. Okay, I'm going to continue the video.
So this is what the spreadsheet looks like when you open a blank copy. You received two. You had a demo version that had some details on there, some fake information, and this is just a blank copy. We'll start with the blank one, and I'll just kind of show you how it basically works. It's always going to open to this Home tab here. You've got a case title. So we'll just say this is, we can call it whatever we want, Main Street. I'll put my name in here. The date is the day that I was kind of entering this. So it's just set to automatically show today's date. You can change it if you want. But the functionality of this, there's basically, when you're in this Home tab, there's a couple of things you can do. You can add new sources. So you can add the green box is going to be an exact or a hard time source, like an alarm panel or a camera, with a timestamp. The yellow is an approximate time source, so that would be like your witness statements. These other two buttons here, import sources, that's what you're going to do if you have, say, multiple investigators with multiple copies of this spreadsheet. Say, one person's chasing down alarm leads, one person's chasing down CAD data and witness statements. At the end, you probably want to combine all those. So rather than having to retranscribe it, you can click on this blue button, and if you have both files, it will join them together. I won't show that here, but you can try it with two files kind of on your own time. The last orange button is for exporting stuff to Word, and we'll go through that at the end. But what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and make two different sources and kind of join them together, and we'll see how the spreadsheet works. So I'm going to start by adding an approximate time source. So I'm going to click the yellow button, and it's going to ask me for a name and a description. I'm going to say witness Bill Fulton, and let's say this is an apartment fire, and Fulton lives in the apartment across from the fire apartment. Apartment across. Okay. So you'll notice that there is a character limit here. So if you get the source name is too long, it's just going to truncate it, and that's because Excel has a limitation for how long this can be. I think this will fit. We'll see. So once you're happy with that information, go ahead and click Add. What will happen is it'll take a second. Excel is a little bit slow in moving between screens, but you'll get this pop-up that says new timeline worksheet was created for witness Bill. Click OK. And now it's going to bring me to this tab. So you'll notice that when we started, we only had home and master timeline here at the bottom. Now we've got this third one, which is our name of witness Bill Fulton, and then TL just means timeline. So that'll always be added. So this is what we call our individual source tab. This is where I'm going to enter the information from Bill's interview. So let's say Bill says, the day of the fire, and we'll say that's May 11th. Bill says that at about 5:30 p.m., he got home from work. So Fulton, okay. The comments here these don't print out with the timeline. So this is kind of like if you just have, for some reason you need to store a comment about that, maybe like what document it came from or what have you, you can type that there. So I can just say came from report of investigation number 32. Just some internal reference for you. You notice you can also add a hyperlink. If you say you want to link to like the PDF document where you have a statement recorded, or maybe you have like a screenshot from a camera, you can do that. It works as long as you're on the same computer. If I take this spreadsheet and I put it on a different computer, unless those files are in exactly the same directory on the other computer, this hyperlink's not going to work. So it'll work on your computer, but once you start sharing it between computers, the link will usually break. So now I've got that. Let's say I want to add another event. I can go add event, and let's say that Bill said he got home from work at 5:30, and about 10 minutes later he looked out his window and he saw some smoke kind of coming from the apartment, and he heard some smoke alarms. So about 10 minutes later, so we'll say about 5:40 p.m., Fulton sees smoke and hears smoke alarm. So that would be another event. And then let's say Bill, so he hears a smoke alarm, sees smoke, and so he goes outside to kind of take a look, and then he decides he better call 911. So he says at about 5:43, so this is maybe 3 minutes later, Fulton calls 911. Okay, so I've got 3 statements from Bill here. And these are again our approximate time. So this is what he thought was his time. You'll notice that when he calls 911, we'll probably have another record of that. So we'll see that when we enter another source, how these kind of mesh together. There are some buttons up here on top of the individual source tab. You have the add event button, which we saw. Resync clock shows up. This is an approximate time, so we didn't sync a clock. So if you click on this, it's just going to tell you this is an approximate time, so you can't do that anyway. Export to Word, we'll do that later. When we're done, we might want to export this timeline so we can put it into an origin cause report. And then you've got copy and paste. So I can actually copy events and paste them between different sources. We won't do that here, but that's something you can try kind of on your own time. So if you, for some reason, you have duplicate events and you don't want to retype them, you can copy and paste. Just using regular copy and paste in here is not going to work. You'll notice the spreadsheet's kind of locked down. So if I try to click down here, it won't let me. And that's because those macros are putting things in specific places. So we don't want to be able to accidentally mess that up. So I'm going to click on home. It's going to take me back to my main sheet. And you'll notice that now I have this yellow banner here that says, witness Bill, who he is. You've got two columns here for time offset and how it was determined. This is an approximate time, so there is no official time offset. This is just Bill's recollection of what time it was. We will see these will populate when we add an actual synchronized time. I can also click here on the bottom to go between the two of those, so I can go back home this way, or I can click the button. If I click on Bill's, the title here, it will take me back to his tab. So now what we're going to do is we are going to add another source, and let's say we're going to add a 911 data. So we got the Cad data from dispatch, and now we're going to add the important parts from that to our timeline. So I'm going to say click here to add an exact time source. I'm going to get the same box that tells me to enter the name and a description. So we'll say 911 Cad dispatch logs, and you can say obtained by whoever, right? Whoever you want. I like to put some description of who got it. That way, especially on these large investigations, you may be working with investigators that you don't really know. And so you probably want to record their name in case you have questions and come back for that. So now once I've got the name here, what I'm going to do is click on sync to time.gov. And when I click that, it's going to make a new sheet, just like it did for Bill's tab. But also now I'm going to get a second box that shows up. And this is our time sync box. And what that tells us is that gives us a way to record the time offset, whether we want to just enter the offset, say we already know it's the dispatch clock is 5 seconds off, we can enter that, or we can actually enter the time.gov times and calculate the offset. So the first easiest way to do it is if you already know, so let's say I called the dispatcher and I went through that process, and I know that the dispatch clock is 5 seconds behind time.gov, I can just type in this, you've got boxes here, so days, hour, minute, seconds. I can just type 5 seconds here, and I can say behind. And now everything that I enter into this CAD timeline is going to be corrected for this 5 second offset. The other thing I can do is I can actually go enter the clock times and the time.gov time and calculate the offset. So let's do that. I will click the yellow button here, and this pop-up comes up and it wants me to enter the time.gov time and date and the source clock time and date. So what this is for is, we mentioned the best way to do this synchronizing is if you have the actual clock. So if you go to the dispatch center and you can see the clock, and you pull up your phone and you can see time.gov, and so you can see those two side by side, and then you or somebody take a picture of those two together, and then that way you will have sort of frozen that offset so you know what it is. Then you can enter it here so you don't have to do the math and count on your fingers. So let's say that when we did this sync, let's make it more than 5 seconds. Let's say that the dispatch center is really messed up and the clock is off by 30 minutes. So let's say that we did that time sync at 4:30 p.m. So it was 4:30 p.m. on time.gov, and it was, you got to enter a date. The reason you have to enter a date is if you have, say like you have a camera that's off by 4 or 5 days, you can correct for the dates as well as the times. But we'll say that this is May 11th. And let's say that when it was 4:30 and 0 seconds p.m. on time.gov, the dispatch clock said that it was 4 p.m. And before you enter this stuff, you really want to just double check and make sure that your numbers are right. You can always go back and fix it, but many times, like we've been going through this and you accidentally select AM here and PM here, you just want to make sure that your times are right when you enter them. So May 11th. And once I've entered the information, if I don't enter all the information, it's going to tell me I'm missing stuff. So if I leave a date off, it's going to say you're missing some information, missing the date, so I'll add that back in. So when I click Get Time Offset, all it's going to do is do the calculation and enter the time in the box here. So now it tells us that our dispatch clock is 30 minutes behind time.gov. And then it's going to make you add a note here. And the reason we have that is just so you memorialize how the time sync was done. So I will say, Maynard took picture of phone with time.gov next to on. Right, and again, that's just for your own reference because, say 2-3 years from now, you have a case that's going back, going to trial, and you're trying to go back and figure out, make sure that everything was done correctly. You'll know how you actually did that in case somebody asks. So once you've got that here, click the big green sync button, and what you'll see is nothing really changed yet, with the exception of this upper right corner. Now you see this text up here. This is actually your time offset. So what this is saying is that everything that I enter in for a source time for this source, this 911 CAD, it's going to have to be adjusted because we know the CAD system is 30 minutes behind time.gov. So an example of that, so we go back and look at our time for Bill. So he said that at 5:40 p.m., he hears smoke and hears an alarm. And you'll notice that I accidentally entered 5:43 a.m. for when he calls 911. So I'll fix that right now. You'll see that when I fix that, it'll actually adjust everything. You've got to kind of click away and come back, but you'll notice now that it resorted. So if you make a mistake here, it's not a big deal. You can fix it and then click away and come back and it'll be fixed. So he said at 5:30 p.m. he got home from work. 5:40 p.m. he hears sees smoke, hears the alarm. 5:43 he calls 911. Well, let's say the CAD, so the first indication that the CAD's going to get is that they get a 911 call. So let's say that their 911 call from Bill, on their clock, it's going to come in at, let's see, we will say, so 5:45, 5:43. So they're going to say at 5:23 and 47 seconds. And again, you want to enter AM or PM here. If you don't, it will default to AM. So say PM. And the description, I'm going to say 911 caller Bill sees smoke and hears alarm. All right, so you'll notice a couple of things. So I entered in the time from the CAD sheet. So this would just be whatever was on the CAD sheet, 5:23:47. I'm going to type that in. Now these two boxes, the time.gov sync date and time, you'll notice you can't change those. Anything that's not outlined in red, you can't change. Well, I guess the comments you can change. But you can't change these two. So you'll notice that it took that 23 and it added this offset. So it added 30 minutes to it. So now everything that I enter for this 911 CAD is going to be shifted up. So if I add another event, let's say that at 30 seconds later, or let's just say a few seconds later, 5:24:16. I'm just making up time. Let's say fire alarm. I don't know, water flow alarm. Zone 1, whatever. It's just made up. So you'll notice I entered 5:24:16, shifted it up by 30 minutes. So now if I go back to my home tab, we'll see a couple things. So we've got both of our sources here. So I've got Bill's information, I've got my CAD. Again, I can click on the name, it'll take me back here. It'll show me the individual source, click back home. So now let's say that we're done. This is all the information we have. Hopefully you have more than that usually. So now we want to see, well, what do these look like when we put them together? So what we'll do is click on this yellow tab down here, which is the master timeline. When I go to the master timeline, you will see that what it's going to do is it's going to take all of these events that we entered and put them all together and with the times synchronized. So this order makes sense to us, right? So we know that Bill said he got home at 5:30. Again, that's an approximate time, and it's flagged as being approximate here. Gets home at 5:30, hears alarm at 5:40, calls at 5:43. Well, if I look at my CAD clock, it was actually 5:53 that Bill called, and maybe you'd want to go back and check his cell phone and see what time the call went out. He was probably just confused about what time it was. We have trouble, knowing exactly what happened at what time without a reference. So you always want to look at this and make sure things make sense. And things may not make sense. You want to go back and check your data, and make sure that your times actually match. Let's say that we talked to Bill again. He's like, no, actually it was a little bit later than that. I would say it was probably like maybe 20 minutes after I got home, 25 minutes after I got home. Well, we could go back and change that. When he hears the alarm, I could go back and change this to whatever I want. Same thing with all these. So if I go back and reread Bill's statement, no, he actually said he got home at 5:40, and it was 5:50 approximately when he heard smoke, and he thinks it was about 3 minutes later. So I can make that change. If I go back to my master timeline, those times are going to be changed. And let's say that, well, no, the fire alarm company, actually, it wasn't 5:54, it was 5:52. Okay, so I go back and let's just change this to 5:52 would have been 2 minutes earlier. So it would have been 5:22 CAD time. What you'll see is, again, if I click away and come back to my CAD sheet, it's going to reverse the order because now the fire alarm is actually what the first call was. And again, this is all just whatever you're inputting into it. But if I go back to my master timeline, now I'll see that the events shifted around. So now I've got this 911 dispatch actually got the water flow alarm before Fulton calls 911. And a lot of times, so if you have the same thing happening with multiple sources, you'll get the same event listed a few times. So this is Bill saying he called 911 at that time. You may have Bill's actual phone as a source, so you might have a timestamp for that, and then you've got the dispatch center. So that's a good way to see that things are matching up and make sense. So now we've got our little timeline here. This is obviously not a good format for your own origin and cause report because you can't copy it, you can't do anything with it, it's all locked up. That's what this export to Word button is for. So if you have Microsoft Excel installed, then you should have Word because they come together in Microsoft Office. So what I'm going to do is click this button, Export to Word. You have two options. You can export as a table or a list, or you can do both. So we'll do both. So I'm going to check both of those boxes. I'm going to hit Export, and it'll kind of sit here for a second because what it's doing is actually making two Microsoft Word documents. So you'll see the first one will show up here in a second. The other one will show up. My computer is not going super fast. There it goes. So let's go back to the first one. So this is the table. This is kind of how I prefer the layout because it's very structured. There's sort of this bulleted or boilerplate text up here that says that this was synchronized with the official US time, time.gov. And then what it does is tells you what your sources are. So I've got Bill, he's in approximate time. I've got 911 CAD, it's got the offset for that. And then it just spits out my timeline, the date, the source, the time, and again, approximate times are listed as approximate, and then what the event is. So now I've got this in, I can just copy and paste this into my origin and cause report. If you look at the bulleted list, it's kind of the same thing, just a different format. So some people might prefer that instead. Basically the same thing. So those are the options for exporting. You can also just export an individual source. So let's say that I only want to export the 911 data because I don't want all this other junk on my timeline. I just want to look at the 911 data. I can do that as well. So I can hit export to Word, and I can do it as a table or a list. It's going to do the exact same thing, but you'll see it doesn't have Bill's information on there. It's just the 911 data that will show up. So there it is. So you see there's no source Bill Fulton. It's just the 911 data. So again, you can copy this. You'll want to make sure if you want to save these, so they're just blank documents. So you've actually got to save it. It doesn't automatically save it for you. Last couple of things. So when I go back home, if I make a mistake, or if I want to change something, so let's say that I went back and looked and oh, this wasn't actually Bill Fulton. This was actually, this was actually Cameron Novak. So I can change it to his name. I can change Novak. And I'd have to go back through into my, my list and change all the specific details, but now everything has changed to be Cameron instead of Bill. So if I go to my timeline, now you'll see it change to Cameron. So you can make those adjustments. You don't have to like go through and, delete it and start over. You can make those adjustments. If you find out somehow that, this is no longer an approximate time, or this is no longer an exact time and you want to change it, you can. So if I click here to edit, one of the options is to change it to an exact time source. If I click this, what it would do is bring up that time sync box, and I'd have to enter the time offsets, and then it would apply the time offsets. And vice versa. I can do that with an exact time. I can change it to an approximate. A couple of last things. You can also resync the clock. So if you made a mistake, later on you find out that you made a mistake, hit resync clock, and that's in the individual source tab for an exact source. And you can actually, the old sync data is there, but you can actually change it. So you can change this to be 60 minutes instead. And when I click sync, what you'll see is, I need to say whether it was ahead or behind. And I can't say 60 because it only goes 59 minutes. So I'm going to say 59 minutes behind. I'm going to sync it. And now you'll see that it actually changed it even more. So now it's, we change our time sync. So now if I go back and look at my timeline, now it doesn't really make sense with the other information I have. So that's, when you get this timeline and you look at it and something doesn't necessarily make sense, that's a good way to go back and look and verify that your time syncs are all set up properly. One last thing. So I showed you the master timeline export. There's a shortcut for that as well. This orange button, what it will give you is two things. It'll give you the master timeline in the list format and also give you a separate document with a summary of all of your sources. So if you click that, it's going to take a second. It's going to create two Word documents again. So this master source list, this is my investigation title, and then I've got my sources, and it just tells me what they were and how the offsets were done. And then the second document is just, again, my master timeline. And that is it for this demo.
All right, Bill.
Hey, Trevor, if everybody wants, you can turn your volume back up so we can actually hear Trevor. And Trevor, I do have a couple of questions for you here. I'm just going to do a real quick check to make sure everybody's muted out. Stand by.
There's a slide in the presentation I didn't show, but if you have questions on some of this stuff, watching that video, it's recorded now, so you can go back and watch it. There's also an instruction sheet that Bill posted. I have a really short attention span, so I couldn't sit through that video and watch it. I'd have to just go back and try it. So that's why that demo copy is included in there. So you just go in there and just play around with it. You hopefully won't be able to find a way to break it, but you might. So always save a copy of it. When you start a new one, just save a copy of it. That way, if something gets corrupted, you don't corrupt the original. We'll always have it. So if you reach out to someone from ATF, CFI, they'll be able to get it for you. And the last thing was, if you have questions on some of these sources, like I said, between Cameron and some other electrical engineers, and then some of our digital forensics guys, hopefully ATF can be of help. But I know there's also a lot of really good state and local resources. So I was just telling Bill how impressed I was with the Wisconsin digital forensics investigators that I've worked with before. So again, don't hesitate to reach out to your CFI if you think ATF can help you guys in any way.
Trevor, are you able to use your chat button there to see the questions that have been posted, or should I read them to you?
I can see them. I got to hide all of the private messages that Adam St. John sent me.
I can only imagine. I'll just read the first one while you catch up. Any good suggestions on visualization of data on an actual timeline?
Yeah, that's something that we've struggled with. On the ATF side, we have some intelligence research specialists that do, a lot of times what they put together as a visual timeline, but it's more for, if you think of, ATF outside of fires, some of these long duration investigations like firearms trafficking or even really complex arson cases. So they're putting together these visual timelines that go for months or years. We have not come up with a good way to visualize it yet outside of text. So that's something we've thought about, but certainly any ideas we're open to, because we haven't implemented anything for that yet.
The next question is, if you're working with a witness statement and using Approximate Times, but also get cell phone data with 911 call time stamps form, that individual, hopefully you can read that because I've totally screwed up that question.
I think I know what you're asking. So the question is, if you have, it's an approximate time, but then you have an exact time from their phone.
And how would you document that in the sheet itself?
Yeah, so we've done that a few different ways. Usually what I will do is maybe make their phone log as a separate source. So, I would have Bill Fulton's cell phone record as its own source, and then, Bill Fulton as a witness as an approximate source. His cell phone would be an exact time, and his witness statement would be approximate. But also, like I mentioned before, a lot of times you'll have duplicate events. So 911 calls, they'll show up on someone's phone. They'll also tell you, yeah, I called 911, and it'll show up in the dispatch log as well. So you will have duplicate events. And that's actually one of the tricks for being able to make sure that you got your time offsets correct is, are all those happening, within the same time? If they're an hour apart, you may have had an issue with a time zone or something like that.
Someone's making a point here that says you might want to remind folks that an event that starts on Thursday evening and something that occurs after midnight going forward, that's actually Friday, because that person's has learned that lesson from that in the past.
Yeah, and fortunately, so in the spreadsheet, that math is accounted for. But yeah, absolutely. When you're getting, so if you're doing timeline normalization, the arithmetic is there for doing the multiple days. But absolutely, yeah, we've made that mistake a lot of times. I think we all probably have.
If you forget to normalize time from a device or a source, is there a limit to when you should try to go back and do that? Or as long as you confirm that no changes have been made to whatever system you're looking at, just document when it was done?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a problem you could run into, especially with DVRs. We've seen a couple times where DVR clocks had gotten reset even prior to us getting access to them. There's really not a good way to deal with that other than, you can ask and you can document what you were told, but there is still going to always be some question: is this clock still exactly what it was at the time of the incident? So that's a great question, and I don't know if there's a good answer for it.
A couple of you have had issues with grabbing the links in the chat. If you copy the link and then paste it into your browser, I think that could potentially be the solution for it. But as you take the test, which I've posted a link to that, and I will repost that now, there is a checkbox in there that if you weren't able to get the spreadsheet, we will send it to you. So I'm going to go ahead and end the recording session for the on-demand and then hang out with us for questions afterward. Trevor, another great training for us, and we really appreciate you taking the time. A lot of you may or may not know, but Trevor is actually Cameron Novak's supervisor at the research lab. So you had a few more than Cameron does, and Cameron always brings a great crowd. So thanks for that, and we really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys on the next one next Wednesday.